Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining our session today. We're really excited to be talking about AI agents and what that looks like with the limitations of traditional identity and access models. So we'll be covering everything, or it's very grounded in, I should say, the survey that CSA just published in partnership with Aembit. We surveyed over 200 different IT and security professionals back in January, and looking at how organizations are actually managing identity and access for AI agents in real environments, and not in theory, but actually in practice what they're doing. And we'll start just with some high-level key findings. There's even more juicy details in the report, so we'll give you a place to download those later. But then we'll dig into a use case of, okay, here's all these problems that we kind of identified. How have organizations actually addressed those in practice, and give you a real use case of how that can happen. So before we get any farther, we should probably do some introductions. So we'll start with myself. My name is Hillary. I am the AVP of Research here over at Cloud Security Alliance. So I help manage the entire research portfolio. I have a team of analysts that I work with on a number of different working groups and working group topics. So we'll produce content on everything from the basics of cloud security to more cutting edge and more interesting things that are kind of on the horizon, like quantum computing or in this case, Agentic AI. As a part of my role, I help run the survey research program, which does custom research and produces custom reports for organizations that are looking to answer some really specific questions. So we were lucky enough to partner with Aembit here, and we have Apurva representing Aembit. So do you want to do a quick introduction of yourself?
Sure thing. Thanks, Hillary. Apurva Davé. I'm CMO at Aembit. I spent a lot of my time actually working with CISOs around their plans for securing agentic. And what I loved about this survey is we had had a lot of hunches over the last year of what we think were happening based on those individual conversations, but we never have the scale to put it together in a way that tells us, are these things widespread, or are we just talking to a certain niche of the community right now? And this data kind of sealed the deal on some of those questions. So I'm pretty excited to share this with our audience.
All right, with that, we'll jump into some of the juicy details that we have for you. So there will be graphics on screen throughout to give you the hard numbers, but we'll kind of talk at a high level about some of this and what it really means. And the first thing that we found was that AI agents don't really have a clear identity. So it's kind of a foundational question when we're talking about identity, right? Like when an AI agent takes an action, who or what does the system think it is? And the answer across most organizations was, well, it kind of depends. Agents don't seem to cleanly fit into existing identity models. So like 52% were like, we use an application or workload identity. But in other cases, 43% are saying, yeah, sometimes we rely on shared or generic service accounts. And other times they are kind of borrowing that human user identity that they're operating under. So only 36% said like, yes, we have assigned AI agents their own dedicated identity. So it's not really consistent. We're not really seeing them being treated as human users. We're not really seeing them consistently managed as first-class machine identity either. So you're seeing kind of mixed approaches within the same environment. And I think that inconsistency has a direct and measurable consequence for visibility. And that was very apparent because 68% of organizations said that they weren't able to clearly distinguish between actions taken by an agent and those taken by a human. 32% said that, we have strong, unambiguous attribution. But there's also like a definitional problem that I think is kind of running alongside this, because we have 63% of respondents that agree that different teams describe AI agents in inconsistent ways. So it's not just that the technology kind of has some ambiguity underlying it, but also the people managing it don't have kind of a common framework for what an agent even necessarily is. So we do have some formal policies that do exist. We've got, like 64% saying their policies differentiate between AI agents and human users, but policy documentation and consistency and implementation are obviously not the same thing. So when different teams are using different definitions, and it's hard to have kind of a uniform approach with enforcement. That becomes really difficult. So the key point here is kind of narrow, but it's kind of a question of identity clarity. So, Apurva, I'm kind of curious. Did you find this surprising, or was this one of those that you're like, we suspected this was coming this whole time?
Yeah, this was coming like a train down the tracks, to be honest, right? What you raised some hypotheses about why these things might be. The most obvious thing that I see in organizations is that they're looking for a path to the quickest possible productivity gain with AI. And that's pretty logical, right? That's kind of what you should do as a business. But in order to do that, people would generally take an AI agent they were building and fit it into an existing concept that they have for identity and access and frankly other forms of security too, even though they're not covered here. So when you end up doing that, you've taken something that's fundamentally unique and new in our world and tried to bucket it with something that already exists. One thing I think was interesting in the data, and we don't really do any analysis on this fact, but when you have different people who claim an identity as it's something different, an application identity, a human user's identity, so on and so forth, we're not distinguishing if different people in the organization are saying different things. So the assumption is like, oh, this company thinks of it as a human, this one thinks of it as a workload. We actually don't know that, right? We could be talking to 5 people in one organization, all who have a different conception of where an agent should fit in. Imagine being the auditor on the flip side of that, trying to figure out, is this a human or an agent taking action? I think that's the situation we're in today.
Definitely. And I think that this has a lot of downstream impacts that we've kind of alluded to here. But the next finding certainly nails it on the head, which is that AI agents are inheriting access. And that means that we're unintentionally kind of expanding that attack surface, even though we might not think that's what's happening. So when the given is that identity is inconsistent for these agents, so how does that actually get determined? And what this finding was really about is the answer, the consequences, the exposure. When we asked how AI agents access is typically determined, 25% say we've got like predefined rules, automation logic in place, and 23% said permissions from the human requesting the action. So only 18% are really saying like, yeah, this access is actually just based on the AI agent's own defined permissions. And what that means in practice in most cases is that access isn't designed for that agent. We maybe have some over access here. And it flows into something else, in a human's entitlements, an existing automation account, that shared service identity that we kind of talked about earlier. And the agent steps into whatever access that context really carries, and whether or not it's appropriate for that agent, remains to be seen. So we have practitioners that are actually kind of pretty clear-eyed about this, which is good. 74%, agreed that AI agents often receive more access than they really should for their tasks, and 79% said that they agree that agents introduce new access pathways that are difficult for them to monitor. So we're not really talking about like an edge case concern. This is something that is very clear to security practitioners already. And when we're asked, practitioners kind of in open-ended responses, what are their concerns about AI agents? We're not poisoning the well in any way. There's no setup for this, but just asking them, what are you concerned about? Overprivileged access was the top theme. It was the top thing that they were mentioning, followed by a lack of visibility, which I think, kind of goes hand in hand based on what we've talked about already. So again, not abstract worries that they really are having. These are things that we can directly point to what the real problem is here. So Apurva, I am curious now, when you see this with the customers that you're really talking to, what does this look like in play then for organizations when they're kind of coming to you and they're like, we know we got a problem?
I think there's a couple interesting angles here. So first of all, if you think about AI agents themselves, we've never had a piece of software in the world that could proactively go out and try to hoard permissions for access. And we've never had a piece of software that you can attempt to essentially socially engineer to give up credentials for access. That's a really interesting dynamic. And one thing I would say was that um, this issue in the kind of in the middle, 81% recognize that prompt manipulation could cause an AI agent to reveal credentials. I would say that's the first and most obvious thing to people, right? That just simply by interacting with the agent, you could reveal credentials. And I think there are two levels that people often come at. Well, therefore, we should stop prompt manipulation, is kind of an obvious addressing of the question. But the other question is, well, why does this agent have credentials at all? Right? And I would say fewer people actually come to that conclusion first and say, why don't we work to eliminate credentials or give the agent credentials just in time so that they can't be manipulated into requesting access? So, like any complex problem, there are multiple ways to look at it. And I think because we're early in the cycle, people are just starting to wrap their heads around what does it mean that AI agents represent a new attack surface and a new form of access.
Yeah. And I think this will lead us very nicely into our third finding, which was that organizations think they're in control, but maybe those controls don't support it. There's kind of that conflict that we've been seeing prior to this of two things are true at once. What really stood out in the data and what was really striking is that there's a pretty meaningful gap between how confident organizations feel and then what the actual underlying controls are capable of. So when we ask them, how confident are you that an AI agent identity scoping and access management, how are you guys feeling about this in your organization? 40% said we've got moderate confidence. We've got 17% that are like I'm very confident, and 19% that are like, well, okay, well maybe I'm not that confident. So we're skewed towards that upper end there, and only 20% report continuous rotation. So immediately we're kind of like starting to divulge here, right? We've got a third of organizations that say they don't know how often AI agent credentials are rotated. So we're starting to see a little bit of conflict here. We had a lot of confidence, but then what do our actual capabilities look like? And, of those that did know the answer, 9% said that credentials are rarely or never rotated, which sounds like a low number, but we're actually talking about 1 in 10 organizations that rarely do. So still a standout number there. So a third of respondents lacking visibility into something as basic as credential rotation, I think is pretty significant when we're looking at control maturity. And consistency in applying access control frameworks is pretty similarly uneven. So we've got, 22% reporting applying their access control frameworks very consistently across AI agents. So, about a quarter, but 18% say, it's only somewhat consistent. 14% are saying it's not consistent at all. And I think part of that challenge comes back to those structural issues that we kind of started this all with, which is that traditional IAM models were designed for static users, predictable workloads. AI agents are neither. They're dynamic. They interact across multiple systems. And sometimes their behavior is difficult for us to anticipate. So the existing frameworks don't always neatly or cleanly apply. So although we feel very confident, there is this perception that we've got this under control, we've got this in the bag. The actual security control maturity, when we really look at the details of it, a slightly different picture emerges, especially when we're talking about those kind of prior issues that we identified when we're looking at unclear identities, we're looking at inherited access. And so it's pretty obvious then that maybe we don't have this as under control as we thought. So I'd love to hear from you, Apurva, before we jump into the use case where we can kind of talk about a real world example of an actual company that went about solving some of these challenges. If there was any last things you wanted to say about the perhaps lack of control that we're seeing in some organizations with AI agents and identity and access management.
So this was my favorite outcome of the survey, actually. And, on the first one, you asked me, hey, is this answer expected? And I said, yeah, we expected this. This one, I did not expect at all. I actually thought people would say, we do not have this under control, and we are building systems to provide control. But here it's a little bit of a moment of like, yeah, no problem, I got this. I've never driven a race car, but just put me in the driver's seat, right? And this is a place where I would encourage everybody to download the survey itself and the survey write-up, which we'll provide at the end, because we have a lot more detail that backs this up. One of my favorite stats that backs this up is almost half of organizations report that in order to limit an AI agent's access, the methodology they use is terminating the compute environment underneath. And that's kind of like saying, well, if a program does something you don't like, what you do is you go pull out the plug so it doesn't have electricity anymore. It's like using a machete for a problem where you need a scalpel. And it's indicative that folks don't necessarily have the controls in place that they can use in a sophisticated way to control an action while letting their business proceed as usual. So really interesting underlying data here that supports this idea that there's a large gap between what people think they can control with AI and what they actually can control.
And now we're going to get into an actual real world scenario that you have dealt with an organization and how they really went about addressing some of these challenges that we identified in the survey. So I'll let you take it from here, Apurva.
Sure, thanks. Would love to tell everybody a little bit about this scenario. Just fair warning, this is an Aembit client, so naturally I use Aembit in the discussion. I think there are other ways to solve the problem. And so I think mostly what I care about sharing are the practices that the enterprise wanted to put in place in order to solve the issue. And here's where we started, which was the financial services organization was looking to build agents on top of Claude to access a range of enterprise systems. Those were both on-premise systems as well as SaaS systems. And eventually, they followed the rigmarole that came about with the release of MCP and the different versions where it started with no authentication or authorization, and then eventually developed some. And they developed a system where Claude agents would integrate with their human IDP and basically provide user authorization for those agents driven by the user. And I think we've all seen it. The pop-up window that says, so-and-so application would like to access all of your financial data, can read and write, and can output this and use that data for personal improvement, right? And you're like, oh, okay, what do? You click allow, so you get your project done, right? And so security was now out of the loop, essentially. There's no centralized control for agents, for MCP servers, or getting to those tools, even if it was sensitive customer data. Now, as a result of this, Claude gets an access credential and would pass that to downstream MCP servers. So now Claude and MCP servers are storing credentials to access these systems. This represented what we saw in the survey data, which was a new source of attack surface, right? And the security team, again, generally not controlling the flow, couldn't necessarily say, well, we know we can securely control this new attack surface. These secrets, of course, were long-lived, that in Claude and the MCP servers could hold on to these for a while, representing basically more time where attack was potentially going to take place. More subtly, Claude was now operating with the full identity and the rights of the user. And again, we talked about this in terms of the first data point. Can you distinguish between your agent and your human? In this case, Claude couldn't, the logs couldn't, and that means audit couldn't either. So you're providing an end-to-end flow, you're providing a layer of identity security, but underlying it are a number of problems that could really come hurt you if something goes wrong. So let's take a look at the next slide, and we'll talk about how they chose to address this. This is where Aembit came into the picture. Think of us as a workload identity and access management control plane for AI. You could build this or buy this in other ways. The things that I think are really important is what the enterprise wanted to solve for. First and foremost, they wanted to remove the burden from the user to say yes to everything and centrally control policy enforcement, while providing just-in-time privileges to the agent based on a blended identity. That blended identity contains both the context of the user as well as the AI agent. So you can distinguish who's making the request. Provide scope isolation so credentials weren't being shared entirely down the pipeline, but instead an identity token for the agent and an access token only between a gateway and that downstream resource. As a result of all that, now you could log access that contains who is the user, who is the agent, what was the policy they triggered, what was the identity credential type they were received, and what type of access credential it received. This is now all kind of centrally manageable, automatable, and fully integrated with your human IDP so that you can get that true sense of blended identity. So there are multiple ways to solve this problem. I think we're early enough in this journey that we know there's not one way to do it. But this was an interesting model used by this financial services company to address some of the issues we saw in this survey. Hillary, that's just one example of what we've seen out there. There's plenty of other models, but with that, I want to kick it back to you to wrap up.
All right. Well, hopefully this gave you a little taste, a little flavor of what you can expect if you download the full paper. So if you scan the QR code that is there, it'll redirect you to the CSA website. You can also find the survey report on Aembit's website as well if you would like to go access it there. It is the identity and access gap in the age of autonomous AI, and that'll give you all the details. We really appreciate you all joining us for this session on how AI agents and traditional IAM intersect, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.